join us this morning in our second AI in the Enterprise online series. We're super glad you're with us, and just wishing that everybody is safe and healthy wherever in the world they are today. And this is a talk series that we started initially. We were set up on campus, and we run these small events on AI in the Enterprise. But post-COVID, nothing is happening on campus. We have these virtual backgrounds behind us that sort of allude to what the campus life was beforehand. But now everything is virtual and real. You can be like Andy and be in a fishbowl if you like as well, which I love. It's pretty awesome. But I wanted to let you know what we're doing here. So this is based out of the Laboratory for Innovation Science at Harvard. We are a lab that sits at the intersection of the business school, the medical school, and the engineering school. And a big part of our effort over the last decade has been to actually study the innovation process as it alludes to AI, study both how people use AI, but also the creation of AI products and services. A lot of our pedagogy has also moved in this direction as well. And this series is really focused on the practicalities of implementing AI in enterprises. I think there's a lot of hype around AI, as we all know, but very little wisdom about what does it take for us to, take an algo and put it into production. And today, I'm really delighted for us to have Pete Skomoroch, who I'll introduce to you in a second, who will walk us through his experience and his perspectives on actually sort of, doing AI product management and sort of data wrangling at scale as well for us. So I just want some housekeeping items out of the way for us before we launch. Please do, unlike webinars, where you can't see everybody, I encourage you to turn your camera on so we can all see you, see your background, and know that you're real people instead of robots hiding in the background. So please do turn your cameras on if you want to. It's okay if you don't want to turn the camera on too, but I encourage you to do it. Second, please do make sure that you are muted so that you can so any extraneous noise or any multitasking noise doesn't come through. If you have questions, please ask them in the chat, and then I'll moderate the discussion with Pete on that as well. And as a FYI, our next session is on the 5th of August with Reza Olafati Saber, who is the global head of AI and deep analytics at Sanofi. And finally, we're recording this session both as a video as well as a podcast, and we'll be releasing the video of this as we come through. Finally, I want to really introduce Pete Skomoroch. Pete is an entrepreneur, investor, and the former head of data products both at Workday and LinkedIn. He's got a really hands-on experience in building AI products and solutions. He's a co-founder and CEO of SkipFlag, a deep learning startup that was acquired by Workday in 2018. He has extensive experience building and running teams that develop products powered by data and machine learning. He was an early member of the data team at LinkedIn, and a product that you probably use every day from them, sort of the skills endorsement, came out of his teams and his projects. It was one of the fastest growing new product features in LinkedIn's history, generating 3 billion endorsements and more than 70 million members in the first year of launch. So you can imagine the scale by which he had to both do the data science side and also the engineering side to make sure this would work. He has a BS in mathematics and physics from Brandeis and research experience in machine learning and neuroscience. And with that, Pete, again, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And I look forward to our conversation.
Great to be here. And I brought some slides that I can share as well as we talk through this. So let me power those up. And here we go. Okay. Are we seeing my a slide that says foundations? Yeah.
We are. We're seeing the presenter view. There.
There we
No,
go.
we're still seeing the presenter view.
Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, we are?
Yeah. So we can see all your slides.
Oh, okay.
You probably want to
Swap
just
display or slideshow. There you go.
Sorry for the technical difficulties.
No, we're still in the hit swap displays.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Good to go?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Foundations. Okay. So this is, in a way, I've given a number of talks over the last few years on this topic around AI product management. And so I thought I'd pull together some material that I thought was really relevant to this topic. And a lot of companies that I talk to, so I've been doing, as you mentioned, some angel investing, advising companies, as well as doing a little consulting to help people, usually in their early days, or if they're struggling a bit to make AI work in the enterprise. And one of the big problems, especially in companies that have been around for a while, but and have maybe a good software organization, but for who AI is new, is that they actually struggle setting projects up for success, right? And so that's a big thing to think about is how do you set up machine learning projects to be successful, and what are the systems you need to put in place to get the most out of your AI platforms and products. And with the right conditions in place, you should see outsized impact across your company, right? Otherwise, everybody wouldn't be pushing hard on AI right now. We all think that there's value there. But one of the things that I think people miss, a lot of people want to dip their toes in the water, but the most important advice I could give machine learning product managers is to make sure that you actually work on something that matters to your business. So a lot of people, might do a proof of concept or a toy project, but then they realize that the level of investment is actually really high to get these things working within the company. And that will set you up for a hard time down the road when there isn't a lot of return on your investment to show. So you really want to be thinking very early about what can have the most impact. And that really comes down to, I think, understanding how your core business and product works. What are the strategic goals of your company? Ideally, your company already has, some quarterly objectives, some metrics, some analytics practice in your business. And really what you want to do, rather than, seeing the latest shiny thing that you could do with machine learning, like deep fakes or something like that with video, it may have nothing to do with your business. Think about your business. What are the core numbers that are keeping you up at night, that are driving your business? And then think about ways that you can actually alter those numbers and improve them using machine learning. And that can be a difficult exercise, and it takes both domain experts, from your business, as well as people who understand what machine learning can do. So this chart on the right of LinkedIn member growth over the years, I think is a great example. A lot of that growth was powered by machine learning in different ways. And one of the most famous examples was LinkedIn's People You May Know, which, will recommend people that you should connect with. And so when people connect on a social network or a professional network, that keeps them engaged. They invite other people. It's a viral process. So keeping that engine running and getting people connected quickly is one of the most powerful things you can do. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in more detail. But the key thing there is that you want to identify things like that can move core metrics to your business. And in that case, it was basically a people recommendation engine. And you need to have strong executive sponsorship and support. These are going to be difficult projects that you undertake, especially if your company doesn't have machine learning already in its DNA. So you need a lot of organizational support. And that includes also data. So a lot of companies, especially companies that have been around for a while, have many different business units, and they may not play well with each other. Their data may be siloed. And some of them may be reluctant, or they're scared or unsure of what you're going to do with the data, how it's, the project is going to go. So you probably want to start with business units where the data is already readily accessible. So I've been talking about AI products, but it still may be a bit mysterious exactly what I'm talking about. So you can see here a bunch of examples of what I would call AI products that you may be familiar with. And the definition that I tend to use is AI products are automated systems that collect and learn from data to make user-facing decisions with machine learning. So that's a pretty narrow definition. There's you can imagine other things that don't fit that definition that do use machine learning. So maybe something which is, giving you better sales forecasts, things like that, but are exposed in a dashboard in your company, things like that, are not as much of a focus for what I'm going to talk about today. I think this loop where you actually have humans involved, where they're giving feedback, you can think about like Netflix recommendations, think about Google searches. Do you click on the link or not? That's a kind of feedback. Facebook photo tagging, similar to what you mentioned. LinkedIn endorsements was essentially tagging people with topics or skills. So all these things work in a similar way. And if you think about consumer internet over the last, 10, 20 years, the most successful companies, you think about Amazon, you think about eBay, Google, Facebook, underneath the hood, the way that a lot of these things work is that you get this data flywheel going, right? So if the product gets better, the more data that you have and the larger the network gets, the more ratings that you have of movies, the more accurate your recommendations are going to become. This creates what we call kind of a data flywheel. And there's a good article by Stephen Levy I recommend checking out on Amazon's artificial intelligence flywheel, and how your wish list on Amazon may also help the Amazon Echo device, right? And the AI that you talk to there. And so every product that you launch in a way starts to help all these other aspects of your business in ways that may not be immediately obvious. And all these products and all these interactions generate data as a side effect. And that data in turn improves the algorithm, right? So you want to get to that virtuous cycle if you can, because companies that get to that point, they hit this level of scale and operational ability with machine learning, which is pretty amazing. And it actually gets easier and easier to ship more of these things over time. So I think you're going to see this divide in companies where some companies struggle and they're struggling to get their first, AI feature or product out. And then other companies get increasingly capable and are able to do this faster and faster. And so this is something I've been thinking a lot about over the last few years, especially, so as you mentioned, I did an AI startup. So I went from having all the resources and the capability of LinkedIn, which is now a part of Microsoft, to a small startup, right? Going from, starting from scratch essentially, right? And using a lot of, where we could, third-party services, things from Amazon, things from Google, but also rolling our own and building our own tech. A lot of companies, I think, are in this stage where, they're still getting started, and they're finding the process a lot more difficult than it seems when you see all the news about what Google's doing or what Facebook is doing. And so I've talked to a lot of people and have been thinking a lot about why this is so hard. And I think there's a number of reasons. The main reason is that machine learning software development is actually very different from traditional software development. So if you bring your experience to bear from, mobile development, from building, even web applications, to the world of machine learning, you're going to hit some challenges. So one of the things is, there is a lot of math involved. There is a statistical model at the core of what you're doing. So you need people who understand the ins and outs of how these models work. But also, even for those people, it's hard to know ahead of time which model, or even if a model will work for a particular problem, right? So your CTO may come to you and say, hey, I want to automatically recognize everybody in the Zoom meeting, do face recognition, which we hear is ubiquitous, and automatically build an attendee list with their LinkedIn profiles. That should be easy, right? It turns out it's not so easy, right? So that's a problem that is actually pretty challenging. You have to do some identity resolution to LinkedIn. You have to do some face recognition on Zoom, and you segment and parse the data if Zoom doesn't have an API. So anyway, so things that on the surface may sound feasible could actually be really difficult. The other thing is most machine learning projects need lots of labeled training data. And there's some interesting things happening in startups working right now on synthetic data and things like that to try to cheat essentially your way to having lots of data when you don't have data. But the reality is, for most every project, you need lots of data and you need lots of labeled data. And so labels mean, so if you have pictures of a hot dog or, pictures with a hot dog in them and pictures without a hot dog, and you have a hot dog machine learning algorithm that detects hot dogs, then you need people to actually label the hot dogs in the images. Or a project I'm actually working on is identifying raccoons in my backyard for a raccoon detector. So guess what? They're a rare event. They're annoying, but I don't catch them on camera that often, right? So I have to figure out how to get some synthetic data to deal with that problem. Another big issue is that machine learning is prone to fail in unexpected ways. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. But because you're dealing with these statistical models and this is a probabilistic process, you're not going to see everything in the data until it's live, right? So it may be the case that I get, in my backyard, if I'm trying to detect raccoons, we get a dog that kind of looks like a raccoon, and now it's, it hadn't seen that in the training data, and now it's detecting raccoons where there are no raccoons. So, that's a silly example, but, there are more severe examples of that happening. The other thing that happens is, I would say machine learning is closer to R&D than it is to, well understood software development. So if you're dealing with any cutting edge algorithms, it's a bit more like a research project. You don't know if it's going to work. And so if you're doing something like, let's say, face recognition on Zoom, and somebody hasn't done that before, you may think that your model is going to work, but it turns out there's some issue with the virtual backgrounds, maybe, the fuzziness around the halo around people's heads. And so it takes you longer than you think. So there's a lot of starts and stops in these projects typically. The other major challenge that people hit is around the actual technology itself is still early. And so if you peel back the covers in a lot of companies that are doing machine learning, there's still a lot of duct tape and glue, right? So people are using, these Jupyter notebooks, which are, kind of web notebooks, and the data scientist may be, writing code in the web browser, not checking in the code. It may only work, on their machine and things like that. It's pretty wild. Actually, the first version of People You May Know, the first version of jobs you may be interested in on LinkedIn, the job matching technology, ran under somebody's desk, right? For a while before it scaled out. And so I think every company, when you peel back the covers, has issues like this, especially early on. And the other thing that happens is that makes machine learning projects different is that data and dependencies change, right? So with software, you may depend on a third-party software library, and that changes. But in the case of machine learning, your underlying data may change as well. And we see this even now with like COVID, right? So a lot of companies had built models. And let's say you're doing forecasting for retail sales, and now all of a sudden the whole world changes drastically, and your model may still be running, based on the old reality, right? And consumer demand and elasticity may have changed significantly. I'll pause there. Before I wanted to talk about AI product management as well, but Kareem,
Yeah, Pete, go back to your prior slide. So two things. One thing, I really like your definition of what an AI product is, which is sort of this automation story. And that you have automated systems that collect and learn from data to make use of user-facing decisions with machine learning. I think that's a very important way for us to think about this, which is that, I can apply a statistical model to anything and put it on a dashboard. But if the data collection and learning process isn't automated, then it's not truly AI. It's basically, a stats model. It could be a fancy stats model. It could be lots of neural nets driving the stats model. But if it's not automated, I think that's a very important element. I think that we should highlight here, and we should just tell our audience that this is actually, makes a difference between the AI systems and the rest of data science that might be out there. How often do you sort of see, in your experience, sort of companies being confused about, is this an AI system or this is just a fancy stats model, and how people sort of don't even get this level of understanding as to what they're building?
I think that's pretty common. So I do think you have, in Silicon Valley, you have, a good number of, unicorns. I don't know what the latest unicorn number is with the current crisis, but, a year ago you had, I think, over 400 unicorns, worldwide, companies with over $1 billion valuation. A lot of them grew very quickly. And those companies tend to, hire from a pool of people who understand machine learning. So if it's in your DNA when you start, I think you get it. But a lot of companies haven't seen this work before. So if you hire people from, Google or Microsoft, eBay, Amazon, a lot of them have seen this work. And I think the cultures in those companies really are a big part of this, right? So if you came from a company where, speed mattered, right? Where analytics mattered, where you're tracking everything. So you think about, the last 2 decades, you had companies like Google, the faster they could load search results, that translated into more dollars, right? If it took, 3 seconds for you to get a search query, you might leave the site, right? And not click on the ad. And so I think that race to speed and tracking to see, okay, where are we losing this person? Where in the funnel did they drop off? Led to all this click data, all this tracking data being available. And then that sets the stage for this kind of product, right? Because they're already tracking the clicks.
Yes.
Many companies that I talk to, even companies that, are consumer internet companies, if they started more from a design-centric place, where they may have a beautiful product and they have they have great product fit, they have lots of users, it could be that, they get to the scale of, they have tens of millions or 50, 60 million users, and they have search. They may not even be tracking the search clicks, right? So I've seen that happen, and so this loop is actually not as ubiquitous as you might think. So I think there are a set of companies that are doing this well. They're tracking all these details on search relevance, logs, so that they can build better AI products. But then there are a lot of companies where it's more bolted on and separate.
Yeah, so I think an important lesson here for us to sort of impart to people is that in established incumbent enterprises that don't have the superpowers of Google or LinkedIn, right, where they haven't done the instrumentation of the data collection, if you want to go to true AI systems with automation, you actually need to build a data collection infrastructure, from scratch almost, and sort of, or bolt it onto your existing systems in order to be able to get that for you, right? Otherwise you'll just be in dashboard land, and that's useful, of course, but it's not going to be true AI-centric organizations.
I think, and I read way too much Twitter and read almost, every article, significant article that comes by on the feeds about AI. And I think that you can see this difference in interpretation pretty frequently. So there are a lot of articles talking about using AI, but what they really mean is guiding an executive's decision, right? So they imagine,
Yes.
oh, there's some box I have like Tony Stark with, was it Jarvis, right?
Yes. Yes.
and the vision of like this godlike CEO who's going to, talk to the AI and it's going to tell them what decision to make is very different from an automated system that is at scale interacting with all your customers.
Yeah. And then the next slide, Pete. So when I look at this list, I'm like, sorry, the one after this slide, the one that sort of says machine learning is still difficult. If I'm a CEO, I'm like, oh my God, this is terrible. Like, why should I even do this? It's like, it's going to be a disaster. Like, it's hard to know which models work. Wow, lots of data, prone to fun. Tell me why I should even start this. Like this tells me warning sign, don't do anything.
It's funny you mentioned this. So I feel like I've gone through this journey myself where I was super excited that every company should be doing this. The answer is actually, in some cases, some companies probably shouldn't, right? Or at least not yet. So I think that if you don't have some of the prerequisites you need, if you haven't, if you're still fighting the last war within your company and you're still getting on the cloud, you're still getting all your tracking in place, diving into a big AI project may not be in the cards for you this year, right? Or you may want to outsource some of it, right? And so I think it's going to be an all the above approach. I don't think anybody is going to not interact with AI in their company. I think some companies may, need to lean more heavily on Amazon or a startup, for some third-party service, especially early on.
Yes.
Maybe that's a good segue. So you're at a fork in the road. I think if you're at that stage, if you're asking,
but you haven't. So regardless, you say to people, do your plumbing first, and even if you want some AI magic and you can work with a startup or work with Amazon for certain things, if you don't fix your plumbing up front, you're not going to be in a set up in a way to be actually take advantage of this at scale.
That's right. And I have a couple of slides. So I can talk a little bit about the actual product management, because that's also the social side is often where these things fall down. So let's say you do have that infrastructure in place, then it becomes often an organizational problem of execution. And then I have a few slides at the end. I can talk a bit more about data infrastructure. And there are some companies like, the good news is if you still are catching up on that journey, there's companies like Confluent, which is built around Kafka and getting tracking set up. That's what we used back at LinkedIn was Kafka. Anyway, there are a lot of different technologies you can use. Another one, a startup I just invested in is called Fresh Paint. So the interesting thing there, another loop that happens that makes everything take forever is people instrument, but only certain things. And then they find out, you do all your tracking, you have all that set up. And then when your AI team comes online or your data science team comes online, they say, oh, we need this data. And it turns out you weren't tracking it. And now you need to reset the clock and start tracking it from this point forward. So what Fresh Paint does is they are kind of this layer that enables you to retroactively go back. If you forgot, oh, I actually want to track this click on this page, you can go back in time essentially and do that. So that's worth checking out. So let's say you have that data infrastructure in place. Where things often fall apart is actually in the execution of these projects. So people, it's hard to hire these folks. It's hard to hire data scientists, machine learning folks. But if you do get a bunch of them into your company, then they need to execute and they need to work with the rest of your business units. And the way that often happens in tech companies is with a product management organization or product managers that are embedded in different verticals. And so the tricky part, again, I mentioned knowing, whether a certain algorithm is going to work or not. I gave the example of, face detection on Zoom and matching to LinkedIn profiles. That's a somewhat hard problem. doing something like, detecting spam emails is a pretty, well-known problem. Recommending movies on Netflix, if you have a well-defined catalog of movies, is a pretty well-defined problem in collaborative filtering. But doing something like automatic summarization. So if you're going to take the text of the transcript of this meeting and have a crisp, well-written article come out the other end of the black box summarization AI, that's actually not an easy problem right now. And so one of the key things an AI product manager needs to know is what is the difference between easy, hard, and impossible machine learning problems, right? And then even if something is feasible, the level of effort may be really high, right? So doing that transcript example, in-house, or doing something like, let's say, OCR, doing recognition of text, like if you have things like receipts in your company that you want to scan, that might be an example where you want to use off-the-shelf AI from Microsoft or Google. They have lots of data. They've been doing this a long time, and their OCR quality is really high. If you were to try to do that project from scratch, yes, you could do it, but it might take a ton of time and effort, right? The other thing that product managers really need to do in this area is have a deep understanding of your company's data. So AI is actually very brittle and fragile right now, right? So what we call AI, let's say you're using TensorFlow, you're using PyTorch, these are some of the frameworks for doing deep learning right now that are most popular. You still have this garbage in, garbage out problem, right? So if you get pristine, clean data from something like a Kaggle competition, or an academic data set that's been curated and prepared, Fei Li, one of the famous data sets in the last decade was ImageNet, which took a lot of effort to put together all these images that you can use for object recognition. But that took a lot of time, and that's why people like her get a lot of credit for that hard work. And guess what? Like those kind of big dig projects in your company are the first stages of the product manager's job. Gathering that data, making sure you have those pipelines in place, making sure that you don't have every data set is going to have issues. And so really knowing those things in and out is actually the first job, and then figuring out mapping which machine learning techniques you can use. I mentioned on that slide of scary reasons you shouldn't do AI. One of them was this idea of uncertainty. And so this is really important to understand, even if everything is working well. So there's this kind of uncertainty, which is, something could go wrong in my project, and it's complex. But there's actually fundamental uncertainty in that these are probabilistic models, and they're learning from examples. And so you kind of set the machine running, and then in a way it takes on a life of its own, right? And so just defining the code doesn't determine what the outcome is going to be. It's the code plus some data, right? And different data could give different results. Data applied in different order in the training process can give a different result. And sometimes you just have to be brave, right? So I like this quote from Jeff Bezos: if you only do things where you know the answer in advance, your company goes away. And I think that's one of the challenges on the product management side is a lot of product managers are fundamentally conservative, and they like to plan, right? They want to have a roadmap. They want to have a plan, out 6 weeks, a quarter, the rest of the year. And your company may have a big planning process where, people have to sign up for objectives and goals. And that can be really hard to map onto this. Sometimes
Yeah, and Pete, what I want to add here is that I think that your first bullet is so interesting, that this getting comfortable with the probabilistic view of the world versus, that's like a head fake for most product managers, right? Because they set up the Gantt chart, they know when this thing is going to ship, they know what the feature set is going to look like, they know all that kind of stuff. And statistics is all about probability, and then if you're applying statistics at scale to the data sets and then trying to build some features based on that, that's also going to be a probabilistic exercise. And so what have you seen how have you seen product managers generally adapt from the traditional software product management worldview to this more of an AI product management worldview and dealing with this uncertainty? What have you sort of seen this come through?
Right. So I think there are different approaches, and I don't think there's one size fits all answer. I think that one way that people handle this is to, a lot of companies have an innovation group, right? And maybe it's under the CTO, maybe it's some separate division, but where they have a bit more latitude and they're allowed to fail. Right. So I think if you go into this saying none of these projects are going to fail, you're in for a rough time. And failure, I think maybe failure is the wrong word. You're going to try things. Some things are going to work. Some things are not going to work, but they're going to get you to where you need to go. So having that portfolio approach, having some risky bets, and then having some things, if you can map some things in your company that look a lot like what other companies have done. Machine learning is fundamentally what a lot of machine learning is copying, right? The algorithms are copying, right? They're copying data that they've seen before. In the same way, the easiest way to solve, back in physics, right? This is what I heard at one point. The easiest way to solve a problem is to have seen it before, right? And
yes.
there's a lot of jokes among physicists, like assume that the cow is spherical, right? And then I can solve that problem if we make the cow into a sphere, right? So I think it's the same thing. Like if you can simplify the problems that you're tackling and do things that look a lot like maybe what your competitor has done, start there. You're more likely that it's more likely those are going to work. Right.
Yeah, and what I'm also hearing is that there's a learning process here as well. And Diego Rodriguez, who's on here, mentioned in the chat also that there's probably a structure fit as well. So those companies that have incorporated sort of design thinking and iteration in their process are potentially, and this is like a great hypothesis. Maybe we can sort of write this down for the Lish team in terms of testing for this. Like those that already have design thinking and iteration approaches in their product development process, maybe more set up to absorb machine learning based AI-based product development, versus those that have a much more rigid waterfall approach on this.
I've seen cases where people, it's also hard. I think that you have people who get what you just said, and people who don't. And so the people who don't, I've seen them nod and say, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
And then in their waterfall, they bake in 2 weeks for iteration, right? So the examples that I gave, like they literally take, I see the same waterfall and then they carve out, okay, we'll give you 2 weeks for exploration, right?
Yes.
And so it's really hard. And the other anti-pattern I've seen in that area is when we go back to, well, what project should we work on? In the world of management consulting and large, tech, service providers, they like to come in and do, they like to involve everyone, right? So you do a big brainstorming session, you get everybody in a room, and it's often a lot of like C-suite or VP level people. And I think that's actually the exact wrong way to start, right? So if you have if you have some people who get machine learning, if you have some people in important business units in your company, maybe get them involved, but have them have a point person that's talking to the people on the ground, whether it's, do you deal directly with end customers? Then go talk to those customers. If it's an internal project, talk to the people who, let's say you're doing an automation project, right? If you're trying to automate something, around, customer support, and you have these customer support people who are, they're burning a lot of time, you feel like it could be more effective, go sit and watch what the customer support people are doing, right? Work with them, talk to them, understand where the bottlenecks are. And that's one of the ways that you can, be more effective. One other thing I'll mention on this point, and we probably won't get through all the slides, but maybe this is an important thing to talk about. Sometimes the organizational challenges can be just too large, and you have to be even creative in organizational design. So if you're at a C-suite level where you can do this, one example that I thought was pretty interesting was SAP, for example. I talked to folks there, and traditionally, as companies become larger, it becomes harder to ship things like this. What they did is actually they acquired some AI companies and they put them in a separate business entity, right? So they had SAP Labs, and that enabled them to escape some of the existing process, right? Because I asked them, how did you ship that so quickly? And they had some example of a conversational AI thing they were doing. They said, well, it's a different business entity, right? And so sometimes it's even just things like that, like legal differences that can make or break your project.
Yeah.
So you hit the nail on the head with uncertainty being a big challenge. So beyond those tactical questions of, how do you change your organizational approach or execution approach, you may even want to think about, whether it's waterfall versus iterative, you may even need to hack the existing process, right? So if you're a waterfall company and it's not going to change, there are still things you can do. So just make smaller waterfalls, right? So take what, if they need a year plan, you can do a year plan and carve it up into, 3 or 4 smaller waterfalls, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And, it may not be the purest form of what you want to do from an iteration standpoint, but the first phase may look like something like get that ETL pipeline running, and our success metrics look like, uptime on that service or something like that. And if you're hitting those goals along the way, that may fit your culture a lot better than trying to, completely change it. The other thing to think about is, if you're Google, you may launch something like Google Photos, and maybe it takes you, I think even for them, it probably took, 2 to 3 years to launch something like that from scratch. But, for you, that might take 10 years for your company. And so rather than bite off that massive project, think about, well, what's one small aspect of that that's going to give value to our users, and get that out and get people excited in your company and launch it. And so at LinkedIn, one example was, you mentioned skills and endorsements. That wasn't built in a day. And the first thing that that our team put out was a set of skill pages, which is kind of like a Wikipedia for skills. That didn't drive massive numbers for LinkedIn, but what it did was it created a user-facing page on the site that enabled us to then start iterating, right, and give us some points on the board. And in almost every company, you're going to have to work with other teams. So that's the other thing that often happens, is these projects just die on the vine because people are waiting for another team. They're waiting for some engineering service, or they're waiting for data. So from a tactical perspective, this is the other thing people often miss, is they have some team off in a room somewhere working on an AI project, and they forget to actually take this portfolio approach and have some clear concept of what they expect to get from each of these. It looks like, Karim, you had something you wanted to say.
No, there's a question up earlier by Julian about how do we measure ROI of AI projects and so forth. But I think what's interesting here, I think you give us a framework, that there's a process view, be more iterative, be more design focused, and do, be comfortable in this probabilistic view of the world instead of a deterministic view of the world. And I think the design thinking world has shown us how to do that with physical products. I think there's a lesson here how to bring those processes into the AI side. I think the other thing which is so interesting is the sort of this portfolio view, which you're saying. Like, take a portfolio view of your company and the projects and say which are risky, which are doable. Get going with the doable ones now, right? Like, don't wait on those kind of things. And even as we sort of said, you got to fix your plumbing. Fixing your plumbing might take you 2 or 3 years, but you still need to be down the pike of being able to do these projects. But I think the other thing is quite interesting is this ROI question, which I think is in many ways is a tough question to answer. Because if it's a probabilistic outcome, we don't know what the ROI. ROI is also going to be probabilistic when your accounting team wants a very deterministic answer. But I think what you're also highlighting, which is interesting, is that this alignment, all right, between business objectives and the data science team and the ML team. I think oftentimes the ML team is out there trying to solve for anti-gravity, right? Versus the business says, I just need this one particular feature done. And the connection between those two is so important. And I think, again, this is where the product manager role for AI is so important.
Yep.
Because if you don't actually have a good sense of the business mission and how the activities of the AI team ML team are going to actually drive towards that, it's just going to be a research project sitting in the wilderness.
And sometimes, and when I started out initially more as an IC at LinkedIn, and then, the data team was like 10, 12 people. And then as we grew and as we scaled, we had added these layers of management, right? And then I had to drive a number of projects. And one of the hard things about, running a larger team working on machine learning like this is those hard conversations. People are really passionate about an idea or an algorithm, but it might not be the right fit. It might be anti-gravity when you need, better sneakers, right? Or something like that, right? And so you do have to stop and kill projects sometimes, right? And I think, so at LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman and DJ Patel, who ran, was the initial person running data at LinkedIn, first chief scientist there, had this portfolio approach. So you had core projects, strategic projects, and venture. And, so there's some question, what % of your portfolio are each of those? But let's say venture is 10 or 20%, right, of your investment. That might look like just taking a few people from your team. If you have a team of 25, 30 people, maybe a couple of them for, a couple quarters are working on some, new project, right? And they're off separately. It may be that everybody spends, 10 or 20% of their time on those projects, right? But it's really important to preserve that, because if you just get into this execution mode where all you care about are, a single metric driving some ROI, then you're not going to get there. And so if you are more ROI focused, I think this is a good example. I have an example here of skill suggestions. So after we rolled out those skill pages, before we got to endorsements where you would endorse, your connections, first we just suggested skills to individuals themselves. And so if you had a blank skill section on your profile, the first UX that LinkedIn had just gave you a blank box, right? And had you type in skills. And it was free form, right? You could put in any text you wanted, comma delimited. And then we added essentially these recommendations. So, hey, Sarah, do you know IT support, management, et cetera? And the difference that's a machine learning model that's, looking at Sarah's profile and inferring what skills she might have. That increased the conversion in that flow up to 40. So 49% of people converted when they were shown that box, which is pretty massive, right? So one out of two people are going to click and add skills when you show them that box. That's amazing.
That's huge. That's huge.
And so you can imagine with all the billions of interactions of people on the site, when you start showing those boxes in different places, now you've got a real data funnel going. And so how did we come up with that, right? So that was, it seems like a small thing, but it drives a lot of data completion, which then powers advertising, which then powers job matching. And you can see all those downstream metrics increase as more people do that activity, right? And so, we were actually pretty detailed about, you gave the example of, well, how do you estimate that ROI? What does that look like? We would literally think about it in that modular way, think about all those flows, come up with estimates, plug in the numbers, and then come out at the end with, hey, this is going to drive revenue up X%, right? When you do this.
Yes. And this is a nice, very simple, but way to sort of think about evaluation, prioritization of AI projects, but also defining, right? I mean, I think, again, you sort of offer very, very simple, but there's this goodness and simplicity. I don't want to say as simple as bad. And actually, simpler the better, because I think if you put a lot of gobbledygook of management speak or technical speak, the decision makers won't know how to evaluate this. So it's the simplicity here is very good.
Yep.
The connection you provide is very good. So I quite appreciate that. I want to ask, we have 5 minutes left, so I just want to get a couple of questions in here as well.
Yeah.
Seth Neil asked this question as to, and this comes from this, like, how do you approach validation of AI from a user perspective, right? Difference between internal validation, which your models are predicting, versus what the users are experiencing. Like, how do you think about that loop as well? So if you gave me suggestions for skills, and I don't believe them. So, 49% is both a good and a bad thing. Is that the 51% that have not responded could be saying, these are useless. Like, this is not telling me what I'm good at. So how do we figure that out?
Exactly. And of course, this is going to be, I had some slides around this kind of topic, and of course I left them out of the presentation, but, so yeah, it's very interesting. So I think part of it goes back to tracking. I think there's two interesting, let's say three approaches here. So one approach is explicitly asking the user, right? So I think that, this in an automated way, what we would do is build in, you need to track the rejections. So for example, endorsements, we would not only track, did the person accept this, but which ones did they skip, right? So you can imagine, let's say you had a bug in one of the skills. Let's say, some weird things can happen, like the ID is screwed up in your ETL process, and all of a sudden, one skill, which is, let's say, Python programming, is actually incorrectly shown as snake charming or something, right? And it's like, why is nobody adding Python anymore to their profile? What's going on? And it's because they were actually presented with snake charming instead of Python or something, right? And so that's in AI products, most errors are actually like that. They're usually invisible, right? And that's an actual error as opposed to just a bad recommendation or a suboptimal recommendation. But what you want to track are things like some impressions. So somebody looked at it, but they didn't click. Rejection. Ideally, you have an X, like, no, this is not a good recommendation for me. Facebook has, in the world of explainability for AI, they started showing, these widgets. Why am I seeing this? And then you could also give feedback, like, this is not, I don't want to see ads like this, or this is inappropriate. And there's actually a startup, I'll shamelessly plug, Fiddler Labs, which has people that came out of Facebook who worked on that feature, so that you can add that to your own products, right? And you can add the user-facing explanations. Yeah. And people want that, especially for things like loans and things like that.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. And so, why don't we go to your last page, slide 21 on your deck, so people have your contact information available here. There's a bunch of there's such a bunch of great questions here as well from Maria, who's asking about how do you review your AI case? How often should you be reviewing your case portfolio? Andy's asking about when do you pull the plug? Diego has a great book recommendation from John Maeda, How to Speak Machine. So if you were to sort of step back, Pete, we have contact information for you both on LinkedIn and Twitter. Pete is available to do consulting work with companies as well. So we want to make sure that we plug you for that as well. But just to take a step back, where in the life cycle are we with AI product management as a discipline that people should be learning about and doing into? Like, are we early stages? Are we at maturity level? And what needs to happen for us to be able to actually build this discipline out?
I think we're in the teenage years, maybe about to enter college, if that makes sense.
So making a lot of mistakes, getting drunk, wrecking cars. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Maybe your teenage years were different.
Mine was the last century. It was last century, so the rules were different.
Yeah. No. But I think that but I think that the capabilities are there. So a lot of the raw material is there. I think what people need, what a lot of companies need, are better blueprints, right? So I think having more examples like this, if we can get more companies, there's lots of startups going after different pieces of the puzzle. So we mentioned the tracking and the data infrastructure. On Twitter, I'll post a few more links to, companies that may be and services that may be helpful for folks at this stage of the journey. I think you're going to see even more acceleration. So I think, in a time of crisis, people are looking for ways to streamline things, to simplify things, for things to work, online. And I think that, I mentioned early on, you have this divide of things that are not online. People are not tracking the data. Now, when you have, issues with the customer, it's going to be more important than ever that you have this, strong online, digital presence. And so more automation is going to happen, not less.
Well, thank you very much, Pete. I know we have 10 more slides to get through, so I'm sure we'll be calling you back, and hopefully you can interact with all of us as well. Take good care. Everybody stay safe out there. Thank you so much.